to do that. Joining you today from the beach, obviously. I hope everybody's enjoying their week. I don't care if it's true or not, but I'm going to thank you for joining us on the first webinar of the Biden administration. We can claim it. I haven't heard otherwise, so we'll go ahead and say that it's us. I'm pleased to be joined today by Sean Ali and Trevor of WestEd. WestEd is a national nonprofit headquartered in San Francisco. They have 14 offices nationwide and focus on research activity, technical assistance, and professional development, especially in the education arena. So thanks to Sean and Trevor for joining us. They'll have a few minutes in a couple slides from now to talk more about their background and why they're such good people to participate in this webinar. And today's topic, get my slides here in order. We'll discuss utilizing data and research in your comprehensive youth violence and victimization prevention grant program. I'm going to start with kind of the standard acknowledgement and disclaimer that the opinions and views expressed today are those of the speakers and not necessarily those of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention or the Office of Justice Programs or Department of Justice. We do want to thank OJJDP for sponsoring this webinar and hope that we all get a lot of use out of it. I'll also start by saying that this webinar, we're really looking to do some frame setting around the use of research and data in the CYBP program. Some of this information may be basic, some of it may be new to a few of you, but we want to make sure that everybody can engage in this conversation. There will be many other opportunities to talk about research and data. And of course, if your site could use specific help, please don't hesitate to mention it to your TA lead. And if we can't help you, we certainly have partners who can. So the webinar today, we'll do some introductions, first of the topic, and then again of Sean and Trevor, talk about goals, and go through some panel presentations, right? So the importance of data research, right? Given the CYBP goals of reducing the incidence of school violence, responding to victimization, exposure to violence and trauma, improving school safety and climate, and preventing violence, delinquency, and victimization, right? How do we depend on research? Being able to identify and examine SMART goals, so making sure that we have goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound as a way to be able to manage the project and determine effectiveness. We like to foster kind of a sense of valuing research and creating a culture of valuing research and evidence-informed strategies and contributing to a continuum of research. That's something that we find very important, especially in working with practitioners. Yeah, we have kind of the high-level research at Department of Justice. A lot of that is sponsored by the National Institutes of Justice. But when we are doing work using limited resources, as these grant funds are, we like to stress the obligation grantees have to make sure that their work has a chance to succeed and to examine whether or not it is. And we don't have the capacity through these grants generally to have a university researcher doing a thorough evaluation of the work. But we do have an obligation to say, you know, these are evidence-based programs, and are they working in the way they're supposed to? And if they're not, trying to figure out why not, and again, contribute to that continuum of research, finding out do these supposed programs work the way they're supposed to, and building on that through replication. The idea of making data collection, research, and review of that data part of your core management strategy, not something that's done at the end, but done on a regular basis. And examining our performance in implementing through data related to process and inputs. Again, are we doing what we said we were going to do? Are we seeing the results that we anticipated? And if no, being able to look at why not. And examining the full range of outcome and impact, being cognizant that there may be outcomes from our programming that we didn't want, nor did we expect, but we need to be on the lookout for those things. Okay. And how can we best use data and research to achieve our goals in CYBP, right? And a lot of this, I know I'm being repetitive. I like to hammer home kind of the basic points. But again, utilizing action research as a tool for program management, examining, again, full range of impacts and outcomes, and implementing programming that is evidence informed, shows evidence of success, or if we're doing innovative programming, it's grounded in promising research, right? Learning objectives for this webinar. We want to make sure that everybody who attends is able to understand and kind of articulate core concepts around action research models, and using data-informed project decision-making and determine progress towards outcomes, that participants will be able to identify traditional and non-traditional baseline quantitative and qualitative data measures, and determine a data collection, analysis, and dissemination process to continue to collect data through the duration of the grant program. And ideally, if we set up a system that's well thought out, you can continue to collect data beyond the end of your grant, just to make sure, again, we talk about sustainability a lot. Are we able to sustain efforts and benefits from programming? And that participants will be able to create processes to identify evidence-based programming strategies that align with the CYBP challenges and grant funding. So, research, not just something you say for that. And this is kind of that action research point that we talked about. And at LISC Safety and Justice, a lot of our experience is through problem-solving processes. We rely on the SARA problem-solving model, which is the larger graphic on your screen. I pulled out some graphics also that show problem-solving models from the education field. And, you know, these models have graphics and nice acronyms like SARA that don't always highlight the circular nature of the process, or didn't, now do. The names don't highlight, unfortunately, a lot of times the circular nature of the process. SARA stands for scanning, analysis, response, and assessment, where assessment is at the end. And I think too often we have thought of evaluation and assessment as something that comes at the end of the process, right? And so we want to be clear that this is something that always happens throughout the grant. There should always be that process of, are we doing what we said we would do? Are we getting the results the way we thought? Indeed, the first part of scanning is really taking a look at to see if you're correct in your assumptions about what problems you even think you have, right? Taking that deeper dive through data, through research, and always being able to use what your data is telling you, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, to confirm or help you adjust your programming. Testing your theory of change. You all have that articulation of how your programming is supposed to work, and need to, again, have the obligation using these limited grant funds. Is it working the way we thought? And being able to be reactive when the data tells you that things may not be going as you wished. Also want to stress that there can be a number of ancillary benefits from data collection: strengthening partnerships, engaging the community, especially if you use tools like participatory action research, and supporting a culture of data and research. I think what has been most striking to me in a 20+ year career in community-based crime reduction is the idea that data collection is now accepted by community organizations and local grantees as not just something they have to do because they're getting federal grants, but as something that can be used to really examine their performance and, again, contribute kind of to the knowledge of the field. When I started my career working with DOJ grantees, the reaction to requests for data was generally one of disdain, if not ignoring those requests. And when we tried to talk to grantees about the impact of their work, the work was often described in terms of impacts on an individual person, right? So we were able to get Johnny to stay in school and he graduated, so we're successful. And it has been striking to me that the field recognizes now, even at the most local levels, that we do need to be able to collect data to have numbers and talk about research-informed work and evidence-based work. I think that's been very gratifying to me and makes our lives and jobs much easier as TA providers. Some other common themes from action research, right? So the idea of, are we doing what we said we would, right? Are we seeing the results or changing patterns that we expect? If it isn't working, why not? An example of being able to course correct and use your data that I have intimate experience with comes from Dayton, Ohio, which on another crime reduction project was looking at burglary and prostitution in the neighborhood and came to realize that the root of the problem was the nascent opioid epidemic. Dayton was on the front end of that. The rest of the country hadn't had that experience yet, so it was new to them in 2013 to see their county with over 100 times the overdose deaths as the national average. One of their efforts was to take the idea of focused deterrence, which is a model used to reduce violence among gang-involved youth, by bringing them in and introducing them to service providers, but also showing them kind of the charges that could be levied against them to help reduce the incidence of violence by groups, right? So in a traditional focused deterrence model, you will be told if anybody in this group, anybody in this gang is involved in violence, the whole group is going in. That kind of persuasive environment was not seen as useful for opioid users, but the model was tweaked. Again, we're talking about innovation based on evidence-based practices to focus much more on the service provision element. And what they found in their Conversations for Change effort in Dayton was that it worked pretty well with male subjects, but that it was not working with female subjects. So using the data that they collected, using the action research model, they investigated why, or tried to investigate why. They found out that for females in the Conversations for Change program, just being in the program was bringing up prior trauma. And so they had to add an element for the female participants that through counseling was able to address that trauma and assist, augment the Conversations for Change model that had been developed. Another important point to remember when we're talking about action research is, how do we course correct? Well, theory drives the vote, bus. You'll have a theory for change based on your program model, and when you're making changes, let that overall theory drive the changes that you're going to make. Benefits of partnering on data. We've been able to see many violence prevention programs that were able to increase their community engagement and cross-sector partnership just through data collection. One small example that you might find extremely relevant is in Nashville, Tennessee. The Martha O'Brien Center was running a violence prevention program that focused on trauma-informed care. And they realized that there was a hole in their programming because they were not involved with the local Metro Nashville public schools and the local elementary school, even though almost all of their small children were going to one elementary school. They helped set up a pilot program for Nashville using the West Virginia Handle with Care program. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, Handle with Care is a notification system for schools, first piloted in West Virginia, in which police departments, if they respond to an incident at the home of a young child in school, send a notification that night or the next morning to the school, just letting them know that, hey, the student had an incident at their house last night. So if there are any behavioral issues, you may want to keep that in mind. They don't provide information on what the incident was. It's just a notification that that child may have been exposed to a traumatic incident. So they were able, Martha O'Brien Center was able to build their relationship both with the Metro Nashville Public Schools and with the police department, which had up to that point been grudging at best in sharing data by piloting Handle with Care in Nashville. Another example of benefits of partnering on data comes from Cleveland, Ohio, the Mount Pleasant neighborhood. The city and federal government had spent tens of millions of dollars rebuilding and renovating Andrew Rickoff Elementary School as part of a walkable schools program, right? And so how do you build on that significant investment when the main problem is that the neighborhood isn't walkable, right? So tens of millions of dollars to build a walkable school in a neighborhood that wasn't walkable. Part of the effort to address that, run by a local nonprofit, Partnership for a Safer Cleveland, was to hire and engage local residents to do surveys, physical surveys of the immediate neighborhood, including surveys of code violations, so that residents could be involved in identifying priorities for Department of Public Works fixes, and also give voice to concerns not just around structural safety, is a sidewalk actually walkable, but where are the places on routes to school where people might not feel comfortable, right? And by bringing in the residents and paying them for their work, they were able to build kind of the collective efficacy, social cohesion, and perceptions of legitimacy in the community, which can be so key for community safety, and be more effective in utilization of those federal funds for construction, and effective in addressing crime and safety issues for the community. Well, also, when we send out this presentation, you may want to check on the link for the Handle with Care program if that's something that you found interesting. It can be really transformative in building relationships in the community, and I think for schools and police departments, a very attractive way to build relationships. Now, so that was a little bit about why, right? Why do we care about being able to collect comprehensive data? Why do we care about being able to recognize data from different sources? And oh, by the way, how do we go about getting that in the context of violence prevention? And we're going to turn now to Trevor Fronis and Sean Ali from Wested to dive deeper into those topics. And I'd just like to invite Trevor and then Sean to introduce themselves a little bit and talk about their backgrounds and what leads them to present here today.
Sure. Appreciate it, Matt. I'll just take a minute to give a little background on myself and then pass it over to Sean before we get into it. Again, my name's Trevor Feronius. I'm a senior researcher with Wested, and within Wested, we have a Justice and Prevention Research Center that's focused on primarily conducting research and evaluation studies of a wide range, focused on school safety, juvenile and criminal justice issues, violence prevention broadly defined, as well as public health and other prevention initiatives such as teen pregnancy prevention that might affect youth and adult outcomes. I think part of the reason I'm here today is really my experience around research evaluation studies that focus on issues that overlap schools and communities. I've led a number of large-scale federal studies and smaller-scale evaluation partnerships focused on issues relevant to school safety and violence. For example, initiatives focused on truancy and chronic absenteeism that involve school community partnerships, school-based law enforcement, community-based violence prevention involving youth, etc. A lot of that work has been inherently multi-sector and involves broad collaboration across different stakeholder groups. And so I'm hoping to bring a little of that into the conversation as we talk about how we go about measuring measuring outcomes within your grants and effective ways of approaching those issues. I'll pass it over to you, Sean, for a sec.
Thank you, Trevor, and thank you, Matt. Again, my name is Sean Ali. I am a senior technical assistant specialist with Wested. And my career to this point has pretty much been around justice technical assistance with some research, a lot of that with through OJJDP projects. And I think what's most pertinent about my previous work to you all here on this webinar is for a few years, I was co-leading some OJJDP grants called the Safe and Thriving Communities. Those are strategic planning grants that focused on youth violence prevention. Just like Trevor said, inherently multi-sector, very broad collaborations with the cities and counties that were the sites for those grants had to come into the grant with established partnerships already. And data sharing was a huge part of that. Evidence-based programs and practices were what we identified and helped them implement and sustain and things of that nature. Also, at that same time, the same firm that I was working with was also running the crimesolutions.gov project, which I also worked on, which translates some of these research findings into really concise and digestible ways so that folks in the field can take those learnings and apply it to their setting based on whatever problems they're having. So Matt's presentation tees it up really nicely, Trevor's will as well. And I'll end with showing how to go through crime solutions and other such research search engines to try and identify these programs and how you can do that in a practical sense. So look forward to sharing that with you all, and I'm very happy to be here.
All right. So I guess I'm up here, Matt, and I'll just cue you up to move the slides along so you can forward. Perfect. Okay, so filling the gaps, a comprehensive multidisciplinary approach to data. It's a mouthful, but as Matt moves on, essentially we're looking to cover learning objective or goal 2 for the day. So recalling back to the slide that Matt had up, these the 2 points that we want to cover in this presentation focus on identifying multi-sector, both traditional and non-traditional types of data, and that could be quantitative as well as qualitative in nature. And then determining a process for data collection, analysis, and dissemination throughout the grant period. I'm going to spend a bit of time on this slide. The others might be a little bit more brief, but there's a lot to unpack in these questions. So considerations for multi-sector measures of school safety and violence. When I'm thinking about considerations, these are really the questions that come to mind to me, both as a researcher as well as in conversations with implementation partners. It's the who, what, how we're going to go about it, and why we're doing it. So firstly, I think a critical question up front, what are you trying to examine? And really this boils down to what are the specific outcomes and how are these operationalized in the within your grant? And those can be operationalized as specific measures, quantitative or qualitative, data points within existing administrative data systems. It could be a process outcome. I think, but the key here is to really drill down to operationally define what those outcomes are. Matt really kind of did a good job on this one, linking to the theory of change or logic models that, hopefully are either defined within evidence-based practices and models that you might be using in your grants, or perhaps there's an opportunity to build these out within your grants themselves. Really, I think what we need to do early on is after you identify and operationalize the outcomes, the key is to really link it back to the theory of change. So if you're looking to have an effect on students' violent victimization experiences in school, but the array of activities that are supported through your program might not be theoretically pointing towards that outcome, then we either need to reassess and address the activities or reframe what the outcome is that you're looking at. Once that outcome's defined, it's important to see who's around you and if the folks that are around you are sufficient to address the outcomes that you've identified to drill into that data. And the folks that are necessary to answer these questions and to respond to identifying the outcomes and examining them, that might vary by the phase of research that you're in. So it might be that you need a specific type or types of gatekeepers who will help you collect the data throughout the grant period. And those folks might vary from the people that need to be at the table for the data analysis portion. It might be that someone's pulling the data for you in Office A, and there's an analyst in Office B actually computing it. And then critically, and I'll probably touch on this a number of times throughout, interpretation. So once you have the analysis, who needs to be at the table to interpret those and speak intelligently to the results? This may be folks who can speak technically to the data and the analysis that's taken place, but probably just as critical, it's the folks who are most impacted by the outcomes that you're looking at. So again, establishing that early on is important to know who you need throughout the grant, but also to establish some trust and rapport and respect across the stakeholders who are going to be involved. Because I can tell you from experience, it's a heck of a lot easier to work with someone who's been at the table throughout than to go and ask for some data at the end of the grant to try to address the outcome portion of the evaluation. So pulling the relevant folks in early on is key. Also, when you're thinking about who's at the table, think about how you're going to triangulate the findings. It may be that you just have one or two outcomes that you're looking at. Likely there'll be several more for you. But regardless, there's ways you can think about triangulating your findings around a given outcome, and that might require multiple data sources and data stakeholders to be at the table. So think about triangulation up front. And I'll, in a couple slides, go into some of the specific data sources. These next 2 points are really just kind of practical considerations for you. You know, the types of data that you collect will have implications for the way in which you manage and store the data, and the ways in which you manage and store the data have implications for the amount of time you're going to need to invest into it, as well as the amount of money that it's going to cost to curate the data that you're collecting for the grant. So I think some of this boils down to the sensitivity of the data, the ways in which you want to use the data within your grant. If you're looking to kind of construct, you know, student level analytic models or track student outcomes over time, or even drill deeply into student specific issues for process data analysis, it'll affect the databases that you're utilizing. Likewise, in terms of just how much time is available to you, it gets back to it's a heck of a lot easier to have folks at the table in the beginning. I'm sure it comes to no surprise to many of you who are on the call that it can take a lot of time to gain access to even existing data. That varies by the agencies and the sensitivity of the data. But you want to start working on those data sharing agreements and memorandum of understanding up front, because it takes a lot of time. Now these other two, I think, again, it relates to who's at the table. What story do you want to tell? So it can be influenced by so many things, right? It might be who is most impacted by the work that you're doing. The stakeholders that are involved in the work that may influence the story that you need or want to tell. Who's funding the work? I mean, we know within this grant, but there may be other key stakeholders who are funding the work, and that would inform the types of measures and outcomes and stories that you need to tell, because it may carry more weight and influence depending on their vested interests in the work that you're doing. Prospects for future funding. There's ways in which you can craft the story that you're telling that's a more compelling, that can be more compelling for future funding opportunities. And then also, what's the focus? Process, outcome, a blend of the two. Are you looking to use the findings to sustain or replicate or scale? These are also kind of key questions to be thinking about when you're developing your analytic plan and approach to the evaluation. And finally, what footprint do you want to leave behind? Carries throughout. Footprint, I think it's something we talk about on our team, as leaving an evaluation footprint behind in our projects. Once the grant period ends, what's left over? And that can be relational, it can be technical in terms of skill sets and capacities, or it can be systems, data systems, etc. So really think about what the long-term goals are beyond the grant period when you are developing these plans for measuring your outcomes in the grants. All right, Matt, next slide. Okay, so just some really kind of practical examples here from the work that I've done, and folks probably broadly within school safety and violence prevention are familiar with, on ways in which you can gather data, both quantitative and qualitative. Some, are pretty obvious. Others maybe are a bit less traditional. So I'll just go through the quantitative examples first, and then move over to qualitative. Student records. This could be student level data on a whole host of data points, from attendance to behavioral incidents and disciplinary actions within the school. It could focus on achievement and learning data points, etc. the student records could be at an individual level or an incident level. They could also be summary data, whether that be weekly, monthly, annual, etc. I think access to the data will vary by the data point. Self-report survey data is always a great way to fold in multiple perspectives. Some key stakeholders in the school community, obviously the students, staff, and parents, but you can also think about gathering data from community members if that's relevant, or potentially, if your part of your grant focuses on working with community-based providers, you could do surveys through those community-based providers rather than directly through the schools. The third point here, it's actually, I'll give an specific example of this from a study that we're wrapping up right now through NIJ, through National Institute of Justice. So police surveys and encounter logs. It's kind of a bit of like a black box when we think about school-based law enforcement. That is exactly how and in what ways school-based police interact with students on a daily basis. It would require a monumental feat to document this throughout the year, but there could be an opportunity to take snapshots in time. So for example, in the work that we're doing, we asked police officers across 25 schools to take 2 weeks and document every encounter they had with students. And we gave some very granular data points that we were looking at. And it presented an opportunity for us to better understand how the kind of categorically the ways in which officers were interacting with students. Was it primarily based because of disciplinary issues? Were they providing support around student well-being? Were they being proactive and instructive, working within classrooms, etc.? So it provides a nice snapshot and something that you can do twice a year or once every year to see how those interactions might change based off of a program or a model or something that you have going on. Some other quantitative data sources, literally like social media hits, and those can be key data points if you can aggregate them up to better understand the way in which students are engaging through social media. It's especially critical right now in distance learning. So there's lots of ways that you can create counts of either typology, word typology, etc., to look at the ways in which students are engaging with each other through different social media sources. And then looking outside of the school and some of these other mainstream data sources, working with law enforcement partners, probation, did some work in California on a grant that was a partnership between probation and the county and the several districts within a county department of education. And it gave us an opportunity to not only look at school-specific student outcomes, but also what the patterns were in referrals to law enforcement and how that changed as a result of the program that students were participating in. Again, who's at the table early on? Get these folks there early to establish trust, rapport, and really allow them to have a voice in the discussion about, why it's important to include the data and what they might hope to get out of that. I think that always presenting an opportunity for some reciprocation is key there. Likewise with healthcare utilization data and child services, child welfare data, it may not be available, specific to each student, but you can still look at these types of data in the aggregate. There's a really interesting study, just as an aside, thinking about the healthcare data around the utilization of prescription drug medication. And some researchers took a look at that before utilization of or access to prescription drug medication from providers around schools, high schools, And they looked at that the utilization rates before and after this prevention program was put in place to see how student utilization in the aggregate changed over time following the program. So, again, just because it's in the aggregate doesn't mean it can't be leveraged to look at some kind of triangulation of outcomes in your work. On the qualitative side, the first couple are pretty straightforward. The methodology of interviews and focus groups are straightforward. I think it's really being super sensitive to the types of folks that you are bringing together, the purpose of those interviews and focus groups, and ensuring that the environment and context in which you're conducting them maximizes the yield for the time and is sensitive to the participants that are involved. Again, an example from the community-based violence prevention space, we were hosting focus groups, and we were working with community members that are prone to violence exposure, both perpetration and victimization. And two kind of related stories. One, we went into a community, and unbeknownst to us, the FBI had opened a field office there the week prior. And so the folks that were in the focus group thought we were from the FBI. So that took a lot of clarifying to maximize yield and make folks feel comfortable. It's the same study. We facilitated another focus group with some community members that are affected by violence, and the police came to that focus group and wanted to participate as a community member, which in of itself is fine, but they showed up in their law enforcement uniform with their gun and wanted to participate as a regular community member with folks who are otherwise kind of disenfranchised and might have a less than positive perspective of police legitimacy. So context is critical and setting is critical when you think about even traditional data collection. I'm going to jump down to photo voice because I think this is a cool one, and it's something that's not utilized a lot in research and evaluation, although it's growing in I think gaining a little bit of momentum. So the idea here is to, you could think about it environmentally. I'll give a very specific example.
Can I interrupt for 1 second, Trevor?
Yeah, go for it, Matt.
James posted a little survey for everybody who's listening in the chat function to see, where do you get your data from? And if people who are listening can take a minute to click those boxes. Also, I'm seconding photo voice, and I know James loves it too.
Excellent. Yeah, so I'll just give a super, specific example to help operationalize this methodology. Take a picture of a locker room or bathroom in your school. Could be a hallway, could be anything, and present that photo to stakeholders that are impacted or involved in your program, and have them write down their observations. You can have prompts, you can have it open-ended. And it's incredible, the diverse perspective that you'll find on a given environmental cue across, students by student subgroups, across stakeholders, students, teachers, community members, etc. That's one approach to photo voice. The other is to send kids out into the school or around the school and have them take their own pictures, give them a prompt and some cues, but have them take pictures that represent or respond to those cues, and then have them provide an open-ended description of why that picture or that setting is important to them. Man, it's powerful. So if you're thinking about ways of triangulating your outcomes, thinking about those types of non-traditional qualitative data points goes a long way. And when we get to reporting out, I think you'll also see opportunities to insert that into the dissemination portion. So I'll jump forward there, Matt. Okay, so what are some indicators of progress along the way? I won't name the whole list here. You can see them all. Key points that I would make here, it's really within the questions. Indicators of progress along the way. Those are going to change over time. So your outcome, you may have proximal outcomes, very near term. You might have medium term outcomes. You might have longer term outcomes or kind of goals, objectives to measure impact. When you're designing an evaluation of your grant or thinking about ways in which you want to document progress, identify milestones that might pre-exist within your data points. Taking student behavior change as an example. You might not see student discipline incidents go down immediately, but you might see the types of student behavior patterns change. So you might see students go from serious violent incidents to non-violent incidents, et cetera. So just because you're not seeing in the aggregate disciplinary incidents changing, if you unpack that a bit, there could be some proximal indicators that demonstrate progress, and progress changes over time. So these are some examples of data that you could collect, very high level examples. These come from thinking back to that prior slide, these would come from those data sources. So discipline could be extant data. It also can be self-report data. The next few are generally self-report data, although bullying and victimization could be extant or observational. You could just document those trends and behaviors that are being observed within hallways or distance learning time. Again, it becomes difficult to observe some of the bullying and victimization patterns that are taking place online, but there is an opportunity to observe that through teachers' perspectives. And likewise, as you go down the list. So I think just being really mindful of the fact that you can establish outcomes, but you can also establish incremental milestones on your way to those outcomes. And just as you did with the outcomes up front, really operationalize what those incremental milestones are along the way. All right, Matt, next slide there. Okay. I'll go 30 seconds on this because I just think it's a great way to visualize the way in which you might think about measuring success. Success means different things for a whole lot of different people. So when we are conceptualizing outcomes for school-based violence prevention initiatives, think about outcomes in terms of the stakeholders and ecosystems that are involved. Think about student outcomes, staff outcomes, student-staff relations, school outcomes, and those could be physical, those could be aggregate school outcomes for students, those could be student subpopulations, family outcomes. Again, going back to that example of the work that we were doing in California, involved a community-based organization providing case management in schools for students prone to absenteeism. And one of the family outcomes, qualitative, was that there was better trust and rapport among families that were historically disenfranchised from the school community. So bringing in multiple perspectives, likewise at the community level. So again, you can think about with your theory of change, mapping that theory of change along each of these ecosystems, and then going about establishing the outcomes for each. All right, Matt. Okay, how do you communicate your findings? Do it all sorts of different ways, and I suspect there's some mandated requirements for how you're going to be reporting on your findings, but there's a whole lot of other ways you can think about it. At a very basic level, the best that you can get away from long technical reports, the better. Folks tend not to read them, as I'm sure, all too familiar. So briefs, they're short, keep them graphical and non-technical in nature. you could conceptualize a whole series of briefs based on whatever outcomes you're looking at, or processes and outcomes. You could envision briefs for different stakeholder groups. That's a great way to maximize the information that you're collecting and tailor it towards specific audiences. Likewise with webinars, they can be tailored to specific audiences, but not a great example of this. Keep it conversational. Obviously, we're not being super conversational right now, hopefully at the end. But keep it conversational and interactive, and record it. Have a record of it so that you can go back and really better understand how folks were engaging with what you were disseminating. Data walks, really cool. You hear it as data walks, data equity walks. They can be presented in a number of ways. And if you hop online, there's kind of templates or how-tos on how to construct and carry out a data walk. Essentially, it's a co-interpretation process with the stakeholders that are affected by the work that you are doing. You kind of do individual walks, and then you do a pair up with two stakeholders to do a paired interpretation. Then you come back as a full group to interpret. And what you're doing is you're posting concrete visuals of the work that you've done throughout the grant. Could be, again, process focused or outcome focused, but you're giving folks a chance to go around and absorb the visual messaging and outcomes that were experienced within the grant, and then have them interpret what that means to themselves. And then town halls is just another opportunity to gather feedback and be future oriented. Facilitate a town hall with community members that might not otherwise be able to engage in these other types of findings. Again, keeping it future oriented rather than super critical in nature is the key takeaway there. All right, I think that's it on my end, Matt.
It is. Thank you, Trevor. Always great to have such practical advice and examples. I'm gonna welcome Sean back, and we'll listen to his presentation for a moment.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you, Trevor. When I saw Matt and Trevor's slides previous to the webinar, I knew it would sort of what they shared would lend itself really well to what I was going to share. But then hearing them talk through it really all comes together. So I hope you all get that out of this. So this portion is focused on identifying evidence-based programs and strategies. And actually forgot to mention when I was giving a bit of my background, I've done this identification of evidence-based programs. I've done it on the in your all's shoes. I was volunteering with my local school district to try and figure out some ways they could some alternative accountability type of programs. So I was on their side trying to dig through and find these evidence-based programs that we can try and replicate, and then obviously on the technical assistance side have helped people try to navigate how to find all that's out there. There's so much as Matt and Trevor have alluded to, so hope to just cover some of that here. So the first thing I wanted to start out with, and it's a slightly different perspective and a slightly different lens than from what Matt and Trevor were discussing. So what does evidence-based mean? It prior to the term really becoming a normal part of the lexicon in all fields, but particularly in justice, there was obviously a need for that, right? To do what works, to replicate what works. If something works somewhere, let's see if it applies here. The issue is with these terms, and it's nobody's fault, it's just how things work. It becomes embedded to everything, and then it can sort of lose its meaning, or its meaning can be distorted, or its meaning could be up for interpretation, and each person's going to view it differently. So that's just what I wanted to touch on here. What does evidence-based mean? Are you required to find evidence-based programs and practices as a part of a federal grant, as a part of a new policy, a new mandate from your state or from your city, or any philanthropic funding? Are you required to use that? What does that person mean by it? Does it have to be something that has been proven effective in X, Y, and Z? And is that X, Y, and Z the same for you as it was in that study? So just I want to touch on just some specific questions that you can ask yourself as you begin to this process of trying to identify what is out there that you could potentially replicate. So what was the evidence? When somebody say this program or strategy is evidence-based, what was evaluated or studied? What specifically? Some of the stuff that Trevor highlighted. Was there a specific theory of change or a specific outcome that a program was looking to do? How was that evaluated? Was it a randomized control trial? Was everything externally controlled for so that, you know, if you got your outcome, it is 100% that? Was it not controlled for? Thus, you'll have to factor that in when you go to apply it to your context. The next question, is it an entire program or model? Is it something in the violence prevention world? A good example of this is Cure Violence or Ceasefire, or any of these large multi-sector initiatives that contain prevention and intervention. A lot of what I've heard a lot of times in the violence prevention TA world is, oh, we heard Cure Violence in Boston worked really well. I want to do that here. So what does that mean? Do you want to take that entire program? Because that entire program, though it is general, there are commonalities regardless of where it is. It has to be, the implementation and the planning of it has to be tailored to what the needs of that specific city are. Boston and Los Angeles are two different places. The communities are very different. The governmental agencies, who's leading, all of those different factors are different. So are you looking at the entire program or model, or are you just looking at a piece of it? Was it just a practice? I sat in on a presentation with a few different groups of OJJDP grantees, and we were talking about restorative justice. So through that presentation, the woman who leads restorative justice in Fairfax County Public Schools, where I live, she spent about 30 minutes talking specifically about restorative justice programs or restorative practices. Is it just one particular technique or tactic that you're using, and has that practice or strategy been evaluated and deemed effective, thus it is evidence-based, or was it the entire thing? And if it is the entire thing, the entire program or the model, was all of that deemed effective, or were only pieces of that deemed effective? And this will all sort of come to life slides down when I start to walk you through what some of these evaluations look like. These are, I just want to kind of set the field for that. How was the study conducted? What were the specific findings? Did youth homicides drop, but youth armed robberies not drop? And are you trying to reduce youth homicides, or are you trying to reduce youth armed robberies, or however it may be? And obviously in the school context, that's a little different, but all of those little contextual things matter. And if we could go to the next slide, please, Matt. And again, just to further the other side of that coin is, how do these findings then apply to you? You find a program, you find this big, beautiful, shiny object. The entire program, every little piece of it was deemed effective by a rigorous evaluation. Everything about it is perfect. You want all of it. They want some of it. Don't get lost in translation. This goes back to how, to Trevor's point about reading and digesting the research, and if you all are on that side, how you're putting it out. So when you see this long 75-page evaluation, you know it's of this program that you love and you know will work in your school district. As you start reading the abstract and the methodology and this and that, you may start to get lost. The places like Crime Solution, or abstracts in a peer-reviewed article or whatever, can give you short synopses, but sometimes you need some of those details. So the best place to start is when you're looking to, when you found the evidence-based program or practice strategy or whatever, once you found that, what are you hoping to do with it? And that shouldn't necessarily be retrofitted in. You found this program and now I just heard it was great and I think it's great, let's apply it locally. It should start proactively with, what do you need? And then you find the program or practice based on that. Identify your needs first, and I'm sure that's a part of your all's process, is a needs assessment or anything like that, or some problem that has already been identified, and look to fill the holes that way. Again, what we'll get to when we start walking through the examples of how to find these. And remember, are you looking for a full program or model? If so, the context matters, similar to what I was just saying. Just because it works somewhere, some things work somewhere, doesn't mean those same things or none of it or all of it will work with you. The communities are different. The built environment, the physical environment is different. The historical context, the local policies that have shaped what's going on, the housing in a particular neighborhood or anything like that, all of those things apply and have to be taken into account. So and the reason why I'm talking so much about these things is, as you'll see when we walk through the examples, it's of the utmost importance. And if it's required in a lot of places through federal grants, policies, whatever, however it's mandated, you want to be sure that you're meeting those marks. If it's required of you, then this is a way to try and think through how to do it correctly so that you're doing everything that you're supposed to be doing. Same with a specific practice or strategy. That context still matters. Just because it's a really small, simple thing, a cognitive behavioral technique that a school counselor can use. Again, that's that school counselor in that school working with those students. Though the theory and the underlying things are still applicable, everything else is different. So you have to factor that in, how it's going to work with you. Next slide, please, Matt. All right, so before I do some of these screen shares, I want to just give a brief overview. So crimesolutions.gov, though I have as the last bullet, is not the be-all, end-all, and I'll explain why that is the case. It is the best place to start. So crimesolutions.gov is powered through NIJ, National Institute of Justice, which is one of the research agency of the Office of Justice Programs. So again, I mentioned I used to work on that project. What they do is they take evaluations that were already done, a researcher or somebody with the relevant knowledge thoroughly reads through it, fills out all of these fields, and then plugs them onto this site. So they are essentially translating the lost in translation piece I missed earlier. They're translating that long, rigorous evaluation into a more concise and digestible format. For the benefit of people in the field like you all who are quickly trying to find something that meets their needs or could potentially solve a problem that you have. So they differentiate, and I'll show an example of this, between programs and practices. They have a rating system if something was deemed effective, if something was deemed promising, and if something was deemed no effect. And the key point I wanted to make on that is a lot of times, and our OJJDP colleagues can surely attest to this, just because something is effective, similar to the point earlier, when it has that green check that I'll show on Crime Solutions, it's and this isn't a bad thing. This is a testament to how helpful this system is. Everybody tends to think, oh, this is great, this works, boom, let's do it. Boston's doing this, let's go do it here in our school district. And that's where that lost in translation can happen. That's where those contextual errors can happen. And you can spend a lot of money and a lot of time, and then at the end of it, fine, I thought it had the green check on Crime Solutions. I thought this was supposed to solve such and such problems or reduce these, have these great outcomes. How come that didn't happen for us? So the point being there is some of them are found promising, and I'll show once we get on there how they define that. But promising means the evaluation didn't show that it is actually effective, but it's close. So the reason why this is important is because there can be a lot of promising things that that Crime Solutions has deemed promising that may work for you. Similarly, there may be things that are effective that may not, the promising, and even some of the no effects. If you have time to parse through things that didn't show any effect, maybe those evaluations, based on that specific context that locality was facing, maybe there was some error on their side that caused them not to be effective, which you wouldn't have on your side, that you can even learn from their mistake and try to implement it properly on your end. And to that same point, the beauty of this is when you have, and I believe Crime Solutions has this too, but definitely when you have a peer-reviewed article, like a full thing, when it tells you who or which specific agency in which locality did this program, I have very, very many times, and have never had any issues, reached out to, let's see, one example was a sheriff's office in Kansas City. This is slightly different from school perspective. They were doing a strength-based case management for reentry for people coming out of jail. There was a evaluation of their strength-based practices that they were taking into account. It was proven effective. I was working with a different county sheriff's office that was looking to do the same thing. Or sorry, probation office was looking to do the same thing. And there, when we were reading the evaluation, it sounded great, but there wasn't that much detail. There was a lot of sort of gray area. So since we had a name, we just Googled them and cold called them and said, hey, I read this research article from 2-3 years ago, you know, as long as it's not 20 years ago. I read this from a few years ago and saw that you guys did this, and we're trying to do something similar. And they connected us, you know, a week or so later. We were able to get on the phone with somebody who was a part of that program who cleared up some of those details. Hey, actually, here's what we did, and here are some of the challenges that weren't in that paper. Here are some of the challenges that we encountered, and here's how we mitigated those. And we were able to, you know, be successful in the end. So we were able to take that research and actually contact the person because we were able to find their thing through Crime Solutions. And we had that peer learning aspect as well. And the reason why I say it's not the be all end all is because by design, because of how thorough and rigorous Crime Solutions is, they have to review everything carefully. There are only so many human reviewers that can review an evaluation and fill out all the necessary fields to get it up on the site. So there's a lag in time, obviously, between an evaluation being done. It's not like it instantly, any evaluation in justice is done, it's automatically up. There's a lag. So there's not everything on Crime Solutions. So the reason why I said this not the be all end all is because I've worked with many agencies and school districts even that have said, oh, I didn't see it on Crime Solutions. I didn't think it was a good idea to do it if I didn't see it on there. You're like, no, it doesn't have to be on there. It's great if it is. Crime Solutions is the best place for it, but it's impossible to capture everything. So next slide, please, Matt. Is it the screen share?
Are you ready to share your screen?
Yes.
All right. We practiced this, so it should go. Yes, you have the ball.
All righty. Let's see here. You did your part, Matt. Let's see if I can do my part. Oh, wrong one.
And looks good.
actually, yeah, I can just use. I had it up and I knew that was going to happen. I had 2 Chrome windows up and knew it would work like that. But okay.
All right, you're good.
Yes, let me get rid of these unnecessary tabs. All righty. All right, let's see. Crimesolutions.gov. My favorite websites, one I have navigated many times. Okay, so here's the landing page, and I know we don't have much time, so I'm going to try to talk quickly. Please bear with me, and I apologize in advance for breezing through this. So here's the effective and promising, some highlighted new programs, which are always nice. Because of that lag, you don't know when things are going to come in, so this is a nice spot to see what has come in. So this nice and easy. I want to view and search the list of all programs. Here's everything, 125 pages. So here are the filters. And so there's all these different ways, and I just want to leave these up for a second for you all to see. There's all these different like typologies to sort by. So I'm going to go into program type. As you can see, there's after school and recreation, alternative school, alternatives to detention. And then there's a school one down here. So I want to scroll through these slowly so you all can catch them. And then all the way down here, we have school and classroom environment that I'll select for this example here. So that automatically filtered. There's still a good amount. So let's see, by evidence rating, breaking my own rules, and just for the sake of the example, we're going to click ones that have been effective. You've seen now there's 5 entries on this page, 4 pages, so we have somewhere less than 20 entries, which is nice. And then you can start to scroll. And in a column that's added here is whether it's a randomized control trial or not, obviously, because that's a much more rigorous study. So let's find one. I'm just going to click on any one just for the example. So as you can see here, it has the program summary, nice and short and sweet. The geography, some of these snapshots over here, extremely helpful. A description, and again, They try to be, and it was one of these people, you try to be as brief as possible, but you want to make sure you have enough information, the components of the program, additional relevant information, tells you what this school specifically is, evaluation outcomes, the math scores, the test scores, absences, methodology, and cost, I know is rarely there. Let's see. Oh, all right. School year costs approximately $19,000 per pupil. So sometimes you'll even have cost information, which can be really helpful if you're identifying a program to help your planning. And very, very quickly going to click through these. Other information about subgroup findings. So this is as digestible and concise as you can get when you're talking really rigorous things. A million different ways to search. Mark crime solutions for sure. Lots of different ways to filter through. Remember, do not forget about the promising. Those are on, I won't click back through, but don't forget about those, because there can still be lots of useful information to pull from promising or even no effect found. Another really quickly that I know is sort of obvious, but you all may not know about is Google Scholar. A lot of times, this is where you can search peer-reviewed journals. A lot of times these are behind a paywall, so you may have to find other ways to try and access them, or may have to pay for them, or maybe able to contact whoever did the study. But you can search anything here. Let's see, school-based violence prevention programs, and you just see a million here. If you're just a quick point, and we don't need to go back to the slides, but a few other examples of places that I had that you can check were Lexis and any of these paid research databases. Those require memberships, and your agencies, your school district may not have them, but through university libraries, sometimes through school district libraries or school libraries, you can have access to some of these paid things, which are sort of, you get full access to everything rather than this limited version here on Google. So ask around. It can never help. If you have a university partner, you can almost always go through them if they're kind enough to run searches for you and whatnot. But those are where you can get the peer-reviewed articles, those full evaluations and research papers that end up in Crime Solutions. You have the entire universe of them in these databases. It takes a lot to parse through, but you can get really tricky. Google how to be tricky with your Google searches in terms of terms and keywords, and exclude this and exclude that. And you can find a good amount of information even just on Google, definitely through those paid things. And Matt, I know we don't have much time left. I'm going to save some time for questions, so I'll just stop there if that's okay.
That's fine, thanks. Yeah, let's move on to questions. I'm going to use my prerogative to start the Q&A. I imagine there's, in any of this type of multi-year grant program, right, we have to change the model of what we're going to do. And for this cohort in particular, COVID-19 has thrown a wrench into many program models, right? So my baseline data took a hit. It's no longer really applicable to the way I was doing things. Any practical advice on what to do now, or how to go about adjusting to that big disruption?
Yeah, I'll jump in just to speak briefly to that, Matt. So this, I'm in the midst of a couple studies myself that were dramatically affected by COVID, and specifically the resulting school closures. So I think there's a lot of key points here. I'm actually going to pop into the chat for folks, for participants. Let me just find the chat. A great website, a resource to check out, betterevaluation.org. Generally has just really great resources around evaluation themes, overarching themes and methodologies, et cetera. But they put together back at the late spring a guide for adapting evaluations during COVID. And specifically, I'll give a couple of examples from the work that we were doing. The adjustments that we made, first you have to acknowledge that there are going to be limitations to the data itself, and that you might need to adjust the types of data that you're collecting as maybe proxy measures for the outcomes that you were originally hoping to look at. So it may have been that you were planning to measure something through a student self-report survey. Well, students work in school, and if they're in school, even if it's distant learning, self-report survey is not priority. I know that firsthand trying to collect them. So it might be working with teachers and staff or collecting, doing a better job through extant data sources to, look at proxy measures of those outcomes. And just a kind of a side note, but related, really make sure that you are taking an equity-based approach to those adjustments that you're making, because you may have designed an evaluation in a certain way that it was equitable in terms of reach and stakeholder input. And when you make those adjustments, it might have effects that are inequitable. So as an example, if you have an online survey and it was planned to be implemented in schools and students move to remote learning, but there's inequitable access to technology, you're not going to be capturing data from the same student population. So, just like an example of a consideration. So take a look at that page, though. I mean, it covers a whole host of key considerations.
Great. Appreciate that. And, it reminds me of some advice I would give kind of in a prior iteration of my career, working with the Weed and Seed National Program, which was federal funding that went to community-based organizations for neighborhood-based harm reduction, and was run by organizations without a lot of experience with evaluation. But again, part of that process of, I think, all organizations valuing research and data collection more. And a lot of the discussions we would have would be about that baseline. And I didn't collect baseline data because I wasn't thinking about assessing my work in terms of data. Did I miss out? And what my response was always, if you view baseline data as the first data collection cycle, right? The first time you collect it, it's never too late to start, right? Mm-hmm. You didn't do baseline, do it now, and that's your baseline. And so I think the important thing for course corrections is just the intentionality of things are different now. So let's respond to it and find out how we have to adjust and just adjust. Mm-hmm. And another point you brought up, and at this point, I'm going to ask anybody who wants to reply. Feel free to unmute yourself, maybe raise your hand or put a note in the chat if you want to reply, and we can call on you. But let's talk about equity and systemic racism and the idea of who gets to decide what success means and how you look for success are not always addressed in terms of equity. You mentioned gatekeepers, Trevor, but how do we promote equity through this work and make sure that we're not installing gatekeepers that then don't look at all possible impacts or different ways our work is affecting people? And I'm glad to have you, Sean or Trevor, start that conversation, but would love to hear from some of the attendees.
Sean, either way, I have comments, but.
Sure, I'll just be really brief in terms of tying it back to my portion about identifying programs and practices that are evidence-based. Just going to be honest, a lot of programs or practices that were implemented or evaluated at least 2 or 3 years ago or later, a lot of them probably were not equity focused. Equity was not a big part of the conversation. It is just now really entered the mainstream, thankfully. So going forward, there will probably be a lot of programs themselves that are aimed at, there's tons of, racial and ethnic disparities and disproportionate minority contact. There was previous tech assistance and grants and funding around that for sure. But generally across the country on the ground level in localities, equity wasn't a big focus for anybody. It should start from now on. So keep that in mind when you're seeing these old programs. Where are the possible disparities that you're going to need to address when you go to implement said evidence-based program? Likewise, there will be more things specifically focused at reducing those disparities, and then those will be evaluated and will be, found effective or whatever. So there'll be a lot more to come in the equity, particularly in justice and in education as well from here going forward, thankfully.
Great. Yeah, just to build on that for just for a minute. I think about that question, Matt, from a couple different perspectives, specifically the ways in which we are operationalizing outcomes in the work that we do in this area, and then how we go about analyzing it to unpack potential disparities, which is an indicator of, in this instance, racial inequity. So in terms of the outcomes, whenever possible as an evaluator, and as a researcher, I like to think about it from kind of a strength-based or asset framing. So not just looking at negative or detrimental outcomes, putting the participants at the center of that conversation to understand what types of growth measures that you and the stakeholders who are impacted by the intervention hope to achieve. Granted, there are going to be measures that that might be required or mandated or critical that carry a negative connotation, but to the extent possible, try to flip that on its head and think about it from a strength-based perspective. I'll give a very kind of specific example within the community-based violence prevention lens. Yes, community violence might be the long-term outcome that you're hoping to achieve, but you might be able to realize that through positive net gains in education outcomes, employment outcomes, housing outcomes, et cetera. So thinking about those positive outcomes, and then from an analysis perspective, the extent that you can disaggregate data to look at subgroups that might be disproportionately affected by the incidents or the intervention that you're implementing. That's key, as well as looking up strategies for comparing subgroup analyses, so incident rate ratios and ratios between groups to see, it's not just it's not just a matter of looking at whether or not percentage changes are different across groups, but how do those percentage changes relate to the overall student body affected by your intervention?
Great, thanks very much. And for me, then again, this idea of promoting equity, having more voices in it. And we've talked in previous webinars, I'm going to call James in now, about processes like asset mapping, right? Identifying everybody who can help you out in this work in the community. And I'm sure, James, you'd love to share the example of your work in New Haven, especially around the youth stat system and how building partnerships through data was able to really impact efforts to reduce youth violence in New Haven.
Sure, and I'm going to share with you their website so you guys can check that out as well. We were doing some youth violence reduction work in New Haven, and they had this really tremendous program called Youth Stat that was very helpful. It had already been developed, and it was focusing on young people that were in high school in the New Haven school system. It was created before we started working with New Haven. It was in response to a young person who was murdered, and they did a lot of work reaching out to individuals that had been violent in schools, and to try to find out, what are some of the measures that they might be able to identify to try to be able to connect them with services that are available throughout the community. And I don't think it's much of a surprise to any of you. Those measures were poor academic performance, multiple suspensions or expulsions, chronic absences, and exposure to violence. So utilizing those data measures, they had identified, I think it was 500 young people that they were going to provide specific services to, and a lot of it was outreach services, engaging them, and their family members to understand, what was going on in their homes. Example was a very simple one. They had connected with a school nurse and said, "Hey, I don't think this young person has been to the eye doctor in a long time." So they had a street outreach worker connect them to an eye doctor, and their grades and their truancy grades went up, truancy went down, and it's very simple thing like that. Obviously, we're going to have a lot more complex cases throughout the school system. But when we started working with them, they noticed that there was a hole in their work. The hole was 7th and 8th graders that were transitioning into high school, and then young people that hadn't been a part of the school or had just graduated. And so they work with community-based partners to connect community-based partners to the UStat system. Prior, it was just school data measures. Now they're going to be incorporating community-based data measures. And so they weren't coming up with new data measures. They were working with their community-based partners and saying, what are some of the important data measures that you are collecting, and how can we add that to the UStat system? And that was very effective in being able to add data measures. They had a little bit of a challenge in getting that into the UStat system, so they oftentimes relied on a case manager to connect the community-based data to the school data, rather than what they really wanted to do was to have the community-based agencies input it on their own. The one thing that has been a challenge for them, and I think you guys also indicated the sites that we're working with. One of the challenges is privacy issues. How do we collect data for young people that are under 18, that it's a health data or law enforcement data? And I know we are very limited on time, but I'm wondering, Sean and Trevor, how do schools address some of those data issues and be able to capture that and share that with each other without violating privacy issues?
It's a great question, James. I know we're running up against time, but I would start with data sharing agreements and memorandum of understanding. It really spells it out, and it also puts down in paper what some of the barriers are to data sharing and access. And once those barriers are made explicit, it provides you with a path forward to either side skirt or create solutions to address those barriers in the data sharing process.
Terrific.
Great. I think that's a great starting point, and also gives me the opportunity to remind everybody. So we'll send out copies of the presentation and make sure we send out some of these links that have been shared with it. We'd like to thank OJJDP. I'd like to thank Trevor and Sean from Wested, and anybody you heard from today would, I'm sure, be glad to talk in more detail with you. If you have questions, if you want to talk more about data research or using those, please bring that up with your TA lead, and we'll make sure you got whatever you need out of this process. So thank you all for joining us today.
And I'll be posting this recording on Basecamp in the next couple of days. And if you have any questions that weren't gotten to, don't hesitate to put it in the comments, or, like as Matt said, talk to your TTA lead.
Plus, I'm around for a couple more minutes if you have anything. I just want to get the thank yous out of the way before people have to drop off.
Thanks all.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks.
Take care.
All right, I think, let me see, is everybody end the recording?
Yeah, we can.